District Attorney Lorrin Freeman joins us now. We're talking about a case that really actually played out on TV in public. A young girl who was a dancer in the Raleigh Christmas Parade was struck and hit by a truck and ultimately killed. Obviously, this is the Raleigh Christmas Parade, huge tradition in downtown Raleigh. Lorrin, walk me through sort of where you were at the time that this tragedy took place.
I was actually out of state at that point in time. I'm on the executive committee for the National District Attorneys Association. They meet on weekends so that we don't try to interfere with during the week. And so I had been at a National District Attorneys Association meeting in South Carolina, was getting ready to head home when I got the first call regarding this, tragedy. Obviously, again, kicked into communications with law enforcement and the prosecutor on the ground here in trying to handle it. But horrific on so many levels situation, and the community witnessing it as it was happening was just particularly traumatizing for people.
Absolutely. So many hundreds of people saw this in real time. And then obviously, did that make it a little bit easier, I would imagine, to know sort of who the suspect was in real time, who the driver of the truck was? Did that sort of expedite sort of gathering the evidence in this case?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, we were in a situation where we knew who it was. We knew what had happened in terms of what had caused Ms. Brooks, death, but what we didn't know is exactly why it had happened. But we were able to immediately, law enforcement was able to immediately zero in on, trying to figure out exactly why it had happened, what had happened.
And so you've got a lot of evidence in this case. You've obviously got, the truck, and we can get into sort of the schematics of things that were wrong in regards to the mechanics of that. But same sort of question as I asked you in another prominent Raleigh case when it came to Austin Thompson. What were the key pieces of the most important evidence in this case?
I mean, certainly the most important evidence was the truck itself. I mean, we were in a position, we had plenty of witnesses who had seen who was driving and what exactly had happened. But in terms of trying to put together why it had happened, which fed into, the culpability, the responsibility of Mr. Glass, it really was the analysis of the truck. We went to great lengths, law enforcement went to great lengths to try to, to have that truck examined, to have things such as the brake fluid in that truck examined. There was only one lab, that we sent that information to. There were very few in the country. I mean, that whole process took time to be able to gather that information, but that was a very important piece. And then the second piece really had to do with just the number of times and incidents where Mr. Glass had vehicles that had not met inspection requirements, and had gotten violations for those, and there was quite a lengthy record of that.
A lot of people, I mean, the rumblings in the community were, they always say, like, well, why wasn't he charged with murder? There is a specific judicial process that goes into something where there wasn't intent in premeditation behind what he did. As the DA, tell me what goes into that once you figured out, who did this, and obviously you have a death. How do you go through, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to charge this guy with?
Right. And so, obviously not all deaths, not all homicides rise to the level of second and first degree murder. And there is, under the law, both voluntary and involuntary manslaughter. And to your point, it has to do very much with, what was the intent? Was there what we call malice? Or was this something that happened, because of some other, level of intent or knowledge about what was going on. In this case, when we have a situation where somebody has tragically lost their lives, part of what we have to do is evaluate the evidence and make a determination as to whether, for example, there was premeditation or deliberation or such, reckless disregard for human life. I mean, that is what was required in order to be able to prove malice, to be able to secure a second degree murder conviction. And so, we did not have evidence of those things in this case. We did not feel like we, could meet that evidentiary burden. And so involuntary manslaughter is what ultimately was charged.
So I remember covering this again every step of the way, and there was everything happened, and then there was a lull, like a very long lull. Everybody kind of wondered if he was going to take a plea or if it was going to go to trial. As much as you can talk about now, what was the long delay? Were you guys preparing for trial, and then his attorneys came and said he's ready to make a plea?
I think there are, yes, and I think there are a number of factors that went into that. I mean, as I've mentioned, some of the analysis on the vehicle, and in particular the analysis of some of the brake line fluid and other things. Again, trying to get to, why had the brakes failed? I mean, that was really the question, right? I mean, what had caused the brakes to fail in a way that prevented him from being able to stop this from happening? And that tied into, what was his level of culpability, what was his level of intent, and that whole process of really being able to evaluate what had malfunctioned in this vehicle took some substantial time. But even beyond that, there was a lot of back and forth trying to, negotiate. Was there going to be a plea in this case? Was there going to be a trial? And then, frankly, ultimately, anytime you have these murder cases, homicide cases, you end up in a situation where you have family members who have gone through a very terrible loss, a huge trauma. And part of it is, giving people enough time to work through. We work very closely with families, try to keep them, on board. We want them to feel part of that process. And it just takes time for families to get to a point where they can engage in those types of conversations in a productive way. And frankly, we don't want them focused on the lawsuit, right, or on the criminal case first thing. I mean, they've lost their child, for heaven's sakes. We want them to have that natural time to be able to start that grieving process before we're hitting with them with, this is what we need to do in this case. What do you think about that? And so all of those things take time, and that can be frustrating to the public, but really is part of how these cases get worked.
So ultimately, he did take a plea, and walk me through sort of what that plea deal entailed.
Yeah, and so as part of that plea, he ended up pleading to a felony different from the involuntary manslaughter that did result in active time of 9 months. It then was followed by a probationary sentence for the misdemeanor death. He ended up ultimately, as to the death, pleading as a misdemeanor death, which is not an unusual plea when there's been a car accident that has resulted in somebody's death. We did this in part so that to try and bring some closure for the family, not to have to go through a trial of the matter. The amount of time that he ended up getting active was what he most likely would have gotten even if he had been convicted of the involuntary manslaughter. So it was similar in terms of length of time and likelihood of the how that would have turned out. Um, I think what's really difficult a lot of times, especially I've seen it over and over again in cases, where at the root you have a car accident that has caused, a death. Most of our laws really are not designed to, be able to hold somebody accountable at a level that mirrors what the loss to the community or the loss to that family is. And I think, unfortunately, in these situations, especially in these car accident cases, families have suffered tremendous loss. The community may feel that sense of loss. And the outcome of what happens under the law really seems insufficient. And that's one of the things we tell the families from the very beginning is there's not anything that we're going to do that's going to be able to close that hole or fill that gap for them.
Yeah, and a lot of the public would say, "Oh, well, the sentence isn't proportionate to what the crime is." But I mean, set the record straight in the fact that, you present this to the family and they do have to agree to this. It's just not the decision of the district attorney's office.
Right. I mean, ultimately, we are the final decision maker, but we do work very hard to, work through these cases with the family. We, were able in this case. I mean, the Brooks family was, really wonderful to work with. Our hearts, of course, go out to them. But yes, I mean, they were very much on board with, getting this case resolved and getting it behind them. They, have ongoing civil litigation regarding this case. They understood that there wasn't anything that we were going to be able to do that was going to bring back Hailey. And as you've seen, I mean, they really wanted to get back to focusing on who she was and all the joy that she had brought to them and sharing that aspect of her life with the community. And so, they were intent on getting this part of this terrible loss behind them.
And lastly, I think one of the things that stands out the most about this case, in my opinion, is it was a preventable tragedy. And like you said, there were a lot of things with his inspections and the brake fluid and things like that. Would you agree that, there was some obviously egregious errors on his part that could have resulted completely differently with this?
I think absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we learned in the course of this investigation that went into our determination of this is that, I mean, he did a lot of his own car maintenance. And, at some point, and whether he had removed it, we were never able to substantiate at what point the emergency brake had been removed from this truck. But there was no emergency brake on this truck. And clearly that was an intentional decision that had been made by somebody to remove that. Would that have prevented the accident? I mean, we can't definitively say that, but, there are things here. And it's important. I mean, underlies why the public policy is that we want vehicles on the road that meet a certain basic, inspection level. And I know, we all have to go get our cars inspected. And, sometimes we feel like that's a frustrating thing or a hassle or whatever. But I mean, there's a reason for that. And that is because, vehicles need to be safe to operate in order to keep all of us safe. And those are certainly red flags here. I think another major red flag, and something that has changed is that, I think the city, didn't require proof of certain information before it allowed vehicles into the parade. And, that was a pretty huge gap, honestly, in terms of just the safety for the community. It seems like to me. And so I think they've changed their process that if you're going to put a vehicle in the parade, you have to provide certain documentation that, that vehicle is actually in good operating order and has, past inspection and things like that.